The small town of Las Cruces, New Mexico, was forever changed on the night of February 10, 1990. The Las Cruces Bowling Alley, a popular spot for locals, was a place of lighthearted fun, laughter, and competition. But that night, it would become the site of a massacre that would leave 5 innocent people dead and a community in shock. Around 11:30 p.m., 2 armed men entered the bowling alley and forced their way into the back office where employees and a few patrons were gathered. What followed was a calculated, brutal killing spree. The gunman shot and killed 3 employees, including the manager and 2 customers. The gunman acted swiftly and methodically, leaving no survivors and no immediate clue as to why this crime had been committed. But there was one detail that stood out, a crucial element that would later reveal a far darker truth than anyone could have imagined. Nothing was stolen. The victims' personal belongings were untouched, and it seemed as though the killers had no interest in money or valuables. This was no ordinary robbery gone wrong. The brutal nature of the crime, the cold efficiency of the killings, and the complete lack of motive would baffle investigators for years to come. But as the investigation unfolded, what was initially assumed to be a random act of violence began to reveal itself as something much more sinister. The 5 victims, who came from different walks of life, had one thing in common. They were all in the wrong place at the wrong time. The employees included Danny Hayes, a young man with dreams of becoming a bowling coach, Kathy Turner, a part-time cashier who had recently moved to Las Cruces, and Joe Carter, the manager, a local figure who had worked at the bowling alley for years. The 2 customers who were killed were Kathy Miller, a young woman in her early 20s, and her fiancé, David Wells, who had been bowling that night to celebrate a recent engagement. Each of these individuals had been living a normal life until that fateful evening when their world was abruptly taken from them. But as the investigation unfolded, new revelations began to emerge about their connections to each other, the criminal underworld, and the hidden dangers lurking beneath the surface of a quiet town. Detective Michelle Turner, an experienced investigator with years of work in violent crime cases, was assigned to lead the investigation. As soon as she arrived at the scene, she was struck by the brutality of the crime. Blood covered the floor, the walls, and even the bowling lanes. But what puzzled Turner the most was the apparent lack of motive. Nothing had been stolen. There was no cash taken from the register, no jewelry, and no personal items taken from the victims. In fact, the only thing that had been left behind was a pile of unanswered questions. Early leads suggested a robbery gone wrong, but the more Turner dug into the backgrounds of the victims, the more inconsistencies began to surface. None of the victims had any criminal history or ties to organized crime. They were everyday people living quiet lives in a small town. Detective Turner began to feel that this wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was something far more calculated. As the investigation continued, there were no eyewitnesses, and no one had seen the gunman enter or leave the building. The surveillance cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned at the time of the murders, and no physical evidence, such as fingerprints or DNA, was found at the scene. The only thing they had was the gunman's actions, which seemed deliberate and targeted. The case stalled for weeks with little progress. Then, a tip came in. A witness had reported seeing a man named Victor Vince Torres, a local criminal with a known history of gambling, drug dealing, and other illicit activities, frequenting the bowling alley in the weeks leading up to the massacre. Torres had been seen talking to Danny Hayes on several occasions, though no one could explain what they were discussing. Torres had a reputation for being involved in shady dealings, but there was no direct evidence linking him to the crime. At the same time, the authorities interviewed Mark Salazar, a young man who had been bowling that evening with some friends. He was the last person known to have spoken to Danny before the killings. Mark claimed that he left the alley before the murders occurred, but his story didn't add up. His alibi was shaky, and he seemed nervous during the questioning. When asked about his whereabouts that night, Mark became evasive. Was he a witness, or was he involved in the massacre? Detective Turner felt uneasy about Mark. He didn't seem like the type of person who would have committed such a heinous crime, but his nervousness, combined with his connections to Torres and his behavior during questioning, made Turner suspicious. The team began digging deeper into his background, and they discovered that Mark was connected to a known criminal organization that operated in the area, one that dealt with illegal gambling and drug trafficking. Mark had even been arrested for a minor offense a few months before the massacre, though the charges had been dropped. The more they investigated, the more questions arose. Was Mark involved in the killings? Or had he just been in the wrong place at the wrong time? And what role did Victor Torres play in all of this? Was he the mastermind behind the attack? Or was he just another pawn in a larger scheme? Months into the investigation, Detective Turner uncovered a startling connection between Mark Salazar and Victor Torres. Mark had been recruited by the local crime syndicate, not as a direct participant, but as someone who could intimidate and silence those who might be a threat to the gang's operations. Danny Hayes had unknowingly become a target after he had overheard a conversation involving illegal activities at the bowling alley. The gang knew that Danny had been making plans to expose them, and they saw him as a liability. Mark was likely coerced into taking part in the killings as a way to protect his own safety and the safety of his family. But even though he was part of the crime, Mark wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. Victor Torres and another unidentified accomplice were the ones who had executed the massacre. The gang had orchestrated the whole thing, using Mark as a pawn to tie up loose ends. A breakthrough came when anonymous photos surfaced, showing Mark Salazar talking to a man in a dark alley in the days leading up to the massacre. The photos were grainy, but they showed Mark and an unknown accomplice discussing something with urgency. It wasn't much, but it was enough to implicate him further. The investigation revealed that Mark had been given a direct order from Torres to ensure that Danny Hayes never exposed the gang. Mark's involvement was now undeniable. Then came a chilling discovery: a set of security tapes that had been previously dismissed. When the footage was re-examined, a shadowy figure was seen exiting the back office shortly after the murders occurred. The figure was too blurred to make out clearly, but the silhouette matched the description of Torres. This was the evidence that Detective Turner had been waiting for. Despite these new findings, the Las Cruces Bowling Alley massacre remains an unsolved case in the eyes of the law. Mark Salazar's involvement was clear, but the full extent of the conspiracy remains unknown. Victor Torres, the mastermind behind the killings, has evaded capture, and his connections to the criminal underworld continue to complicate the investigation. The case was never fully solved, and the families of the victims continue to seek justice. The emotional toll on Detective Turner and the victims' families is immeasurable. The truth about the massacre may be closer than anyone realizes, but the answers may never fully be uncovered. For Detective Turner, the case remains an unfinished puzzle, with pieces scattered across a dark and dangerous world that many would rather leave undiscovered. The Las Cruces Bowling Alley massacre continues to haunt the memories of those who were affected, and the truth remains buried, waiting to be uncovered.